We inhabit a planet of ghosts. We walk through forests that have forgotten how to sing, and swim in oceans that have lost their chorus. To the generation born today, this quiet world is normal. The sky seems full, the trees are green, the world feels complete. But it is a grand illusion, a beautifully rendered painting with 3/4 of its subjects erased. Just a century ago, the Earth was a symphony of life, a chaotic and vibrant explosion of 1 billion different forms. Now, an eerie calm reigns. There was no asteroid, no supervolcano, no nuclear winter. The end came not with a bang, but with a whisper that stole the breath from 75% of all living things. It was the Great Quieting, the most profound extinction event in 65 million years, and it happened while we were watching. This is the story of how we lost our world and didn't even hear it leave. Before the silence, there was a symphony, a sound so dense and complex it was the auditory signature of life itself. In the heart of the Congo Basin, the Ituri forest was one of the world's great concert halls. For 30 years, bio-acoustician Dr. Aris Thorne had made it his life's work to capture its music. Every morning, before the sun breached the canopy, he would be at his post, headphones on, microphones aimed at the waking world. His recordings were not just noise, they were data. Each chirp, buzz, and call was a note in a composition billions of years in the making. The performance began with the low-frequency hum of 1 million unseen insects, a foundational drone upon which everything else was built. Then came the birds. The piercing cry of the Congo peafowl, the melodic cascade of the red-crowned malimbe, and the frantic, rhythmic drumming of the great blue taraco. By mid-morning, the primates joined the chorus. The booming territorial calls of black and white colobus monkeys, a percussive counterpoint to the birdsong. Every sound told a story. A sharp staccato alarm from a hornbill signaled a prowling leopard. The soft, insistent buzz of the glasswing katydid was the sound of pollination in progress. Aris could close his eyes and see the forest in 4 dimensions. He could map its territories, track its migrations, and gauge its health, all through the medium of sound. His work was a race against time, but not in the way he imagined. He believed he was simply archiving a world threatened by chainsaws and bulldozers. He was creating a library of sounds so that future generations might hear what a truly wild place sounded like. He documented the intricate relationship between the ghost orchid and its single specialized pollinator, a hawk moth whose wing beats produced a unique frequency just above human hearing. He spent a decade trying to isolate the courtship song of the azure-throated sunbird, a sound so rare and fleeting it was considered a local legend. When he finally captured it, a shimmering 3-second melody, he felt he had preserved a piece of the planet's soul. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, Aris packed away his sensitive equipment. The nocturnal orchestra was tuning up, the chirps of frogs, the drone of mosquitoes, the distant rustle of a forest elephant. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. It was a world in perfect, vibrant equilibrium, a planet at the peak of its creative power. He did not know he was recording a song that would soon have missing notes, a symphony on the verge of losing its orchestra. He was capturing the last echo of abundance, a final, resonant chord, before the great quieting began. The first sign was not a sound, but the absence of one. 5 years after his benchmark recordings in the Ituri, Aris Thorne was back in his university lab, thousands of miles away, analyzing comparative data. He was running a new spectrogram of the forest's evening chorus when he saw it, a tiny, empty band in the 4.5 kHz range, a missing sliver in a once solid wall of sound. To a layperson, it was invisible. To Aris, it was a glaring error. He ran the diagnostic again, assuming equipment malfunction. But the gap remained. He pulled up his archives from a decade prior. There, the band was bright and solid. He knew the frequency by heart. It was the distinctive, bell-like call of the ivory-striped tree frog. He told himself it was a fluke, a localized population decline, a temporary migration. Such things happened. He sent an inquiry to his field station, but the response was inconclusive. The frogs simply weren't calling this season. But then, other whispers of silence began to arrive. A colleague working in the cloud forests of Borneo emailed him, perplexed. The Lumina firefly, a species whose synchronized flashing was a famous tourist attraction, had failed to appear for the third year in a row. The forests were now just dark. Another researcher, monitoring hummingbird populations in the Andes, reported that the saber-winged hummingbird, a key pollinator for over a dozen species of mountain orchids, had vanished from its entire known range. There were no signs of distress, no evidence of a new predator or disease. They were simply gone. These were disparate events, separated by continents and oceans, affecting amphibians, insects, and birds. They were statistical anomalies, footnotes in ecological journals. Most of the scientific community was focused on more visible crises: habitat loss, climate change, pollution. This was different. This was subtle. It was a silent subtraction. Aris became obsessed, creating a global network of bio-acousticians, all sharing their data. The pattern that emerged was chilling. In every ecosystem they monitored, from the Great Barrier Reef to the prairies of North America, signature sounds were disappearing. Not the roars of the great predators, but the foundational hums, clicks, and chirps of the smaller creatures. The background noise of the planet was being erased. Late one night in his lab, Aris printed out 2 massive spectrograms of the same patch of forest, recorded exactly 10 years apart. The first was a rich tapestry of lines and waves, a visual representation of life. The second was visibly thinner, pocked with blank spaces, like a worn-out cloth. The structure was still there, but it was frayed, weakened. He traced the empty spaces with his finger, each one a ghost, a voice that would never be heard again. It was then that the quiet dread in his mind coalesced into a terrifying certainty. He leaned back in his chair, the hum of his computer suddenly feeling loud in the sterile room. He whispered to the empty lab, "They're not moving. They're not hiding. They are being turned off." The Amazon rainforest. From space, it remained an ocean of unbroken green, the lungs of the planet. But on the ground, and more critically, in the canopy, the intricate machinery of life was seizing up. The phenomenon was no longer a whisper. It was a pervasive, growing quiet that was causing entire ecosystems to unravel. The canopy, once the busiest and noisiest layer of the forest, became the epicenter of this silent collapse. Here, life was a vertical dance of consumption and pollination, a complex web of dependencies built over millennia. And now, the dancers were disappearing. The emerald-crested manakin, a small bird famous for its elaborate, noisy courtship rituals, was one of the first to go. Its absence was felt almost immediately. The manakin was the primary seed disperser for the sunstone berry, a crucial food source for howler monkeys and tapirs. Without the birds to carry its seeds, the sunstone plant's range began to shrink. Within 5 years, it became a rarity. The monkeys that relied on it grew thinner, their populations dwindling, their calls becoming less frequent in the morning chorus. This was the cascading effect scientists had always feared, but it was happening without a clear cause. There was no new disease, no obvious environmental toxin. Species were simply fading out of existence. The insects went next. Orchid bees, responsible for pollinating hundreds of species of tropical flowers, vanished in droves. The result was an arboreal ghost town. The canopy, once bursting with the vibrant colors of countless blossoms, became a monotonous green. The flowers bloomed, their colors vivid, their scents alluring, but they waited for a pollinator that would never arrive. They were beautiful, sterile decorations on a dying organism. The forest was becoming a perfect green museum, a magnificent collection of living things that had lost their purpose. It looked alive, but it was failing to reproduce. Scientists from around the world descended on the Amazon, desperate for answers. They deployed drones with hypersensitive sensors. They analyzed tissue samples. They sequenced genomes. Every theory they proposed, a subtle atmospheric shift, a neuroactive fungus, a strange form of solar radiation, led to a dead end. The agent of this extinction was selective, patient, and completely invisible. It targeted specific organisms while leaving others untouched, disrupting the connections that held the ecosystem together. It was like a saboteur meticulously removing key screws from a vast machine. For a while, the machine appears to run normally, but the internal stress is building until the moment of catastrophic, silent failure. From the forest floor, a visitor might not notice anything was wrong. But for those who knew what to listen for, the silence from the canopy above was the most terrifying sound on Earth. The problem was no longer confined to remote jungles or isolated ecosystems. The silence was spreading, seeping into every corner of the globe. It was a pandemic of absence. The crisis had moved from the pages of obscure scientific journals to the forefront of global consciousness. What began as a series of disconnected anomalies was now understood as a single planetary event. On the Great Barrier Reef, a marine biologist presented underwater footage that stunned the world. The corals, though stressed by warming waters, were still there. But the soundscape was a ghost of its former self. The constant crackle of snapping shrimp, the background hum of a healthy reef, was down by 70%. The clouds of tiny, iridescent fish that once swarmed every outcrop were gone, leaving the larger predators to patrol an eerily empty, beautiful cityscape. In Kenya, a veteran conservationist displayed 2 decades of tracking data for the region's elephant herds. Their ancient migration routes, followed for centuries, had become erratic. The elephants were wandering, confused, searching for specific fruiting trees, acacias, marulas, that were no longer bearing fruit. The pollinators they depended on, a host of native bees and moths, had disappeared. The great animals were walking through a landscape that visually appeared unchanged, a garden that no longer offered food. In the farmlands of Europe and America, the change was more personal. For the first time in centuries of recorded history, the spring arrived without the call of the cuckoo in England. In North America, the nightly chorus of crickets and katydids in late summer grew fainter each year, until entire regions fell quiet after sunset. People began to notice the stillness in their own gardens. The familiar buzz of bees was replaced by a sterile quiet. Windshields, once splattered with insects after a long drive, remained unnervingly clean. A special United Nations summit was convened, bringing together the world's greatest scientific minds. They presented their findings with a shared sense of urgency and bewilderment. They had no enemy to fight, no visible threat to combat. They were fighting a phantom. The loss was incalculable. It was not just the number of species, but the severing of billions of ecological connections, the fraying of the entire planetary web of life. The psychological toll on humanity was immense. A new term, ecological grief, entered the public vocabulary. People felt a profound sense of loss for a world they had taken for granted. For the first time, humanity felt truly alone. A chilling question began to form in the quiet places of public and private conversation. If the invisible force could erase 3/4 of the planet's species, from the smallest insect to the largest mammal, what was to stop it from erasing us? The camera holds on a child, looking up at a silent, birdless sky and asking her parent a question for which there is no answer. Where did all the songs go? 50 years on. The world did not end in fire or flood. It settled into a new, quieter reality. The phenomenon was given a name, the Great Quieting. Humanity endured, a testament to its stubborn adaptability. But the planet was forever changed, haunted by the ghost of a richer, more vibrant past. Cities hummed with a purely mechanical energy. The only birdsong heard was from digital speakers in public parks, playing archival recordings for a generation of children who had never heard the real thing. Agriculture became a sterile, technological marvel. Armies of small, autonomous drones, guided by satellite, moved through vast monoculture fields, pollinating crops with mechanical precision. The wild, unpredictable bounty of nature had been replaced by a fragile, human-managed system. We find Dr. Aris Thorne, now an old man, his hair white, his movements slow. He walks through the Eerie forest, the site of his life's defining work. The trees still stand, tall and majestic. The light still filters through the canopy in cathedral-like shafts. But the place is a hollow shell. The air is still. There are no monkeys chattering in the branches, no birds calling warnings, no insectile hum. The only sound is the rustle of leaves under Aris's own feet. In museums, the most popular exhibits are the sound archives. People don a headset and are transported back in time to Aris's original recordings. They weep as they listen to the dawn chorus of a world teeming with life, a symphony their ancestors took for granted. The cause of the Great Quieting was never definitively proven. A leading theory suggested a complex, self-replicating prion that spread through the global ecosystem, targeting specific neurological pathways in a vast array of species, but leaving humans and a handful of others untouched. But it remained a theory, a ghost story told by scientists. The lack of a clear answer was perhaps the most unsettling part. There was no one to blame, no lesson to be learned, other than the profound fragility of the systems that support life. Aris sits by a stream, the water flowing over rocks making the only sound. He holds the old weathered headphones he used all those years ago, but he does not put them on. There is nothing left to hear. He looks out into the silent, green emptiness, a living monument to an immeasurable loss. Humanity had spent centuries looking to the stars, listening for signs of extraterrestrial life, never imagining that the most complex and beautiful chorus in the known universe was right here, in our own home. We always expected the end to come with a roar, a bang, a final, terrible cataclysm. But it came as a gradual fading. We did not lose the world all at once. We lost it one song at a time, until all that was left was us. And the silence. The silence came first, a quiet so profound it was unnerving. But the true consequences of the great fading were not auditory. They were structural. The first domino to fall was not the grandest, but it was the one that showed us the game we were in. In the great northern forests, the disappearance of apex predators like wolves and bears was initially, tragically, celebrated by some. It was seen as a victory for safety, for livestock, for human dominion. But nature's balance sheet is ruthlessly precise. Without predators to check their numbers, herbivore populations exploded. Vast herds of deer and elk, once symbols of wild grace, became a relentless, consuming tide. They moved through the forests not as grazers, but as locusts. They ate the saplings first, ensuring no new generation of trees would rise. Then they stripped the bark from mature trees, leaving behind skeletal, gray forests that would never recover. The undergrowth, home to countless insects, rodents, and birds, vanished completely. What was once a complex, multi-layered habitat became a barren parkland of dying giants and bare earth. When the rains came, there was nothing to hold the soil. Rivers that had run clear for millennia turned thick with mud, choking the life out of aquatic systems downstream. The intricate architecture of the ecosystem, built over eons, was being dismantled in a single generation. This pattern repeated globally. In the oceans, the loss of sharks led to a boom in mid-level predators, who in turn decimated the populations of smaller fish that kept algae in check. Coral reefs, already stressed, were smothered by algal blooms, their vibrant colors fading to a uniform, sludgy brown. We had thought of extinction as a series of individual losses, like lights going out one by one. We were wrong. We had not simply removed pieces from the puzzle. We had removed the interlocking tabs that held the entire picture together. The planet was not just emptying, it was coming apart. The silence was the overture. The cascading collapse was the symphony of destruction that followed, and we were only just beginning to hear its terrifying crescendo. While the world watched the dramatic collapse of forests and reefs, a far more fundamental unraveling was happening beneath our feet, unnoticed. It began with the disappearance of the planet's humble, tireless recyclers. Fungi, beetles, worms, and countless microbial species, the vast, invisible workforce that managed the planet's nutrient cycle, faded away. Without them, the process of decay itself began to fail. Fallen leaves in the autumn no longer melted back into rich humus by spring. Instead, they formed a dry, brittle mat that smothered the soil. Animal waste, once quickly broken down and reintegrated, now persisted, fouling the land and waterways. The world was becoming a sterile repository of its own refuse. This had catastrophic implications for agriculture. For centuries, humanity had relied on the living soil, a complex web of organisms that aerated the ground, fixed nitrogen, and made nutrients available to plant roots. As that web tore, the soil began to lose its vitality. It became mere dirt, a collection of inert mineral particles, incapable of supporting complex life. Corporate agro-tech firms promised solutions. They engineered sterile, hydroponic megastructures and nutrient pastes designed to replace what nature had once provided for free. But these were fragile, energy-intensive systems. They could produce calories, but they could not replicate the complex micronutrients found in naturally grown food. Globally, crop yields from traditional farming plummeted. Fields that had been fertile for thousands of years could no longer produce a viable harvest. The soil was no longer a partner in cultivation. It was a problem to be solved. We had spent a century looking to the stars, dreaming of terraforming other worlds, all while the ground beneath our own civilization was becoming alien and inhospitable. The crisis was not one of food quantity, not yet, but of food quality and resilience. The very foundation of our existence, the rich earth itself, was becoming a ghost of its former self. The web that connected life and non-life, the cycle of renewal that defined a living planet, was broken. And we were learning a terrible lesson. A planet can be green, but not alive. There is a unique kind of silence that falls upon an apple orchard in full bloom when there are no bees. It is a beautiful, terrible quiet. The blossoms, perfect and white, wait for a visitor that will never arrive. This was the silence that announced the next phase of the collapse, the one that struck directly at the human dinner plate. The great fading had claimed the vast majority of Earth's pollinators, the bees, butterflies, moths, bats, and birds that were the essential link in the reproduction of over 3/4 of the world's flowering plants, including most of our food crops. The effect was immediate and devastating. The global supply of fruits, nuts, and vegetables imploded. Almonds, blueberries, avocados, melons, all became relics of a bygone era, their flavors and textures consigned to memory and data files. Coffee and chocolate, once daily rituals for billions, became luxuries reserved for the ultra-wealthy, grown in tiny, fortified biodomes. Humanity scrambled to adapt. The age of the brush began as millions of people were employed as manual pollinators. In vast orchards and fields, armies of workers moved from flower to flower, dabbing pollen with tiny brushes in a slow Sisyphean effort to replicate the work of billions of lost insects. It was a logistical nightmare. The window for pollination is short, and human labor could never match the efficiency of nature. Robotic drones, the so-called mechanized bees, were deployed, but they were expensive, prone to failure, and could not adapt to changing conditions. The world's diet grew starkly monotonous. Humanity fell back on the handful of staple crops that did not require animal assistance. The wind pollinated grains like wheat, rice, and corn. Bread, pasta, and cornmeal became the foundation of nearly every meal. The vibrant colors vanished from our plates, replaced by shades of beige. Malnutrition soared, not from a lack of calories, but from a profound lack of vitamins and minerals. The world had not starved, but it was becoming profoundly unwell, a civilization sustained by empty calories on a planet that had lost its flavor. For generations, humanity had viewed the oceans as a boundless resource, too vast and deep to ever fail. The Great Fading proved how fragile that blue expanse truly was. The collapse on land was mirrored by an even more profound transformation at sea. It began at the bottom of the food web. The catastrophic decline in phytoplankton and zooplankton, the microscopic organisms that form the foundation of marine life, was the critical blow. They were the meadows of the sea, and when they vanished, everything that depended on them began to falter. The great schools of krill, herring, and sardines disappeared, and with them went the predators that hunted them. The grand migrations of tuna ceased. The haunting songs of whales faded from the ocean's soundscape. Coastal communities that had depended on fishing for millennia saw their livelihoods evaporate. The billion-dollar industrial fishing fleets rusted in port, monuments to a vanished abundance. But the loss of life did more than just empty our nets. It changed the very chemistry of the water. Without the vast filtering capacity of oysters, clams, and countless other species, coastal zones became choked with pollutants and prone to explosive, toxic algal blooms that created vast, no-go zones. The oceans, which had served as the planet's primary carbon sink, began to lose their ability to absorb atmospheric carbon dioxide, accelerating planetary warming. A new and bizarre ecosystem began to emerge. In the place of complex food webs, the seas became dominated by simple, hardy organisms, jellyfish, and certain types of algae. Great flotillas of jellyfish, some stretching for hundreds of miles, became a common sight, pulsing through the empty waters where whales once roamed. The ocean that had inspired art, poetry, and exploration for all of human history was becoming alien. It was no longer a cradle of life, but a vast, warming, and increasingly uniform environment. We looked out at the horizon and saw the same blue water, but it was a facade. The heart of the planet was weakening, and its once vibrant pulse was growing faint. In the final accounting, the Great Fading was more than the sum of its lost parts. It was a systemic trauma from which the entire planet reeled. The intricate feedback loops that had maintained a stable climate for 10,000 years were shattered. The consequences were no longer isolated to specific ecosystems. They were global and geophysical. The loss of the great forests, particularly the Amazon, fundamentally altered global weather patterns. Regions that had been temperate became arid dust bowls. Monsoons failed in Asia, while Europe experienced unprecedented flooding as rivers, no longer moderated by healthy watersheds, raged out of control. The sterile topsoil of the world's agricultural heartlands, now unbound by roots or microbial life, was lifted by the wind. Continent-sized dust storms, visible from orbit, became a regular phenomenon, reducing sunlight, disrupting air travel, and causing a public health crisis in major cities. This was not the climate change humanity had debated for centuries. This was a planet in a state of shock, its vital signs erratic and failing. The psychological impact on the human species was profound. A collective melancholy settled over civilization. A new diagnosis, solastalgia, the distress caused by environmental change, became commonplace. Art and culture turned inward, obsessed with memory and loss. Digital archives of birdsong and whale calls became treasured artifacts, played in quiet rooms to children who would never hear them in the wild. Humanity endured. We survived in our climate-controlled cities, sustained by manufactured food, connected by a global network of information. But we were a lonely species living in the quietest house imaginable. We had become the sole custodians of a planetary museum, surrounded by the ghosts of what we had lost. The extinction had been silent, arriving without a bang or a roar. But its consequences were now the loudest thing on Earth, a constant, howling reminder of the richness that was gone. The final, terrible question hung in the quiet air, a question we were now forced to ask ourselves for the rest of time. In our pursuit of everything, why did we sacrifice it all? When we imagine the end of an age, our minds conjure images of fire and fury. An asteroid, a brilliant harbinger of doom, streaking across the prehistoric sky. Continents shaking as supervolcanoes tear the world apart, choking the atmosphere with ash. These are the cataclysms, the grand and violent finales we have come to expect from Earth's deep history. For decades, paleontologists and geologists searched for the signature of such an event to explain the Great Fading, the period when 3/4 of all life on the planet vanished. They searched for the geological punctuation mark, the definitive scar left upon the Earth, but they found nothing. Dr. Aris Thorne, a geologist whose career was built on reading the stories in stone, spent years examining strata from that period on every continent. We look for the iridium layer, he explains, the unmistakable calling card of a major asteroid impact. It's present at the end of the Cretaceous period, marking the dinosaurs' demise. But for the silent extinction, the layer isn't there. The element is stubbornly, frustratingly absent. Similarly, the search for massive volcanic activity yielded no answers. Dr. Lena Petrova, a geochemist specializing in large igneous provinces, confirmed the findings. The great flood basalts, like the Siberian traps, leave an indelible chemical footprint, she states. Their eruptions coincide with other mass extinctions. But at this boundary, the Earth's volcanic heartbeat was calm. There was no fever, no great eruption. The evidence, or lack thereof, pointed to a terrifyingly different conclusion. This was not an extinction of sudden violence. The fossil record showed a slow, creeping decline over thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, of years. Species did not vanish in a geological instant. They faded. One generation was simply less abundant than the last. Coral reefs quietly ceased their growth. Forests thinned. The oceans grew silent. It was a planetary tragedy that unfolded not with a bang, but with a prolonged, almost imperceptible whisper. The killer was not an external force that struck from above or erupted from below. It was something more insidious, more intimate. Thorne and Petrova were forced to abandon the familiar narratives of geological catastrophe. They realized they had been searching in the wrong place all along. The clues were not buried in the planet's crust. To find the culprit, they had to look inside the victims themselves. The key to the silent extinction lay hidden in a realm invisible to geologists' hammers and chemists' beakers. It was locked away in the most fundamental building block of life, the genetic code. In the sterile laboratories of the Max Planck Institute for Paleogenetics, a revolution was underway. A team led by the brilliant Dr. Kenji Tanaka was pioneering techniques to extract and sequence fragmented DNA from exquisitely preserved fossils, samples millions of years old. Their goal was audacious: to perform a genetic autopsy on an entire lost ecosystem. They were hunting for a common thread, a shared biological flaw that could explain why so many disparate species succumbed. For 2 years, the project yielded bewildering results. They sequenced the genomes of extinct marine reptiles, ancient insects trapped in amber, and mammals locked in permafrost. The data was a flood of information, but it told no coherent story. The extinct creatures were genetically diverse, showing no obvious shared vulnerability. Frustration mounted in the lab. The project seemed destined for failure, another dead end in the greatest mystery of them all. But science often advances not through grand pronouncements, but through quiet observation. A junior researcher, Maria Flores, was tasked with running a new pattern recognition algorithm designed to scan not the genes themselves, but the vast, non-coding regions of the genome, long dismissed as junk DNA. One Tuesday afternoon, an alert flagged her screen. The algorithm had found something. It was a tiny, repeating sequence, just a few hundred base pairs long. Alone, it was meaningless. But the algorithm had found the exact same sequence in the genome of an ancient ammonite. Then, it found it again in a saber-toothed mammal, and again in a prehistoric bird. Species separated by millions of years of evolution, living in different ecosystems, on different continents, all shared the same inexplicable genetic signature. Dr. Tanaka's team worked feverishly, testing every sample they had. The pattern held. Every single species that vanished during the silent extinction carried this genetic marker. Every species that survived did not. It was a statistical impossibility, a ghost in the machine. The sequence appeared to do nothing. It coded for no protein, regulated no known biological function. It was just there, a silent passenger. But its perfect correlation with extinction was undeniable. They had found the weapon, but they had no idea how it worked or who had pulled the trigger. The discovery of the anomalous genetic sequence, which the scientific community nicknamed the Lazarus sequence, sent shockwaves through the fields of genetics and paleontology. It was a clue of unprecedented significance, but it was also a profound paradox. How could a piece of seemingly inert DNA be associated with the greatest extinction event in Earth's history? The world's leading research teams pivoted to answer this question, entering into a global collaboration. Dr. Aris Thorne's geological expertise and Dr. Kenji Tanaka's genetic data were combined, creating a powerful new front in the investigation. Their working hypothesis was radical. It wasn't about what the sequence did, but about what it was. Under high-resolution atomic microscopy, the structure of the Lazarus sequence revealed itself to be unlike anything seen before. Natural DNA, shaped by eons of random mutation and selection, is beautifully imperfect. The Lazarus sequence was not. Its repeating elements were flawless, its helical twist possessing a mathematical purity that felt alien. It lacked the scars of evolution, the remnants of ancient viruses, or the chaotic footprints of jumping genes. It looked less like a product of biology and more like a feat of engineering. This discovery pushed the team into the strange world of quantum biology. They began running complex simulations to model how this unique structure might interact with the subtle energetic fields within a living cell. The results were astonishing. The sequence appeared to function as a highly sophisticated resonance cascade. It didn't change the organism's biology directly, but it subtly amplified the efficiency of its mitochondria, the powerhouses of the cell. It turned them into supercharged engines, allowing the organism to process energy with incredible effectiveness. It was a tremendous biological advantage, a gift. But it came with a hidden, fatal price. This hyper-efficiency created a deep, systemic dependency on a very narrow set of environmental conditions. It was an evolutionary golden cage. The moment those external conditions shifted, the supercharged system would not just fail, it would collapse entirely. The ghost in the machine was not a flaw. It was a feature. It was a piece of technology, a biological tool of immense power and immense danger. The question of how it worked was eclipsed by a far more disturbing one. Who, or what, had built it? The revelation that the Lazarus sequence might be a form of biological technology forced the investigation beyond Earth. If this molecular machine was not a product of terrestrial evolution, its origins had to be sought in the vastness of space. The search shifted from genetics labs to the sterile clean rooms of astrochemists and the silent domes of remote observatories. In the bone-dry air of the Atacama Desert, Dr. Evelyn Reed, a leading expert in prebiotic chemistry, was analyzing the molecular makeup of interstellar dust and ancient meteorites. Her work was not a search for alien life, but for its potential precursors, the complex organic molecules that form in the cold vacuum between stars. Her team focused on a specific class of meteorite, carbonaceous chondrites. These primordial rocks are relics from the formation of our solar system, 4.5 billion years old. They are cosmic time capsules containing a pristine sample of the chemical soup from which the planets were born. For months, Dr. Reed's analysis of a meteorite fragment recovered from Antarctica revealed the expected compounds: amino acids, sugars, and fatty acids. But deep within a tiny sealed inclusion, her instruments detected something unprecedented. It was a complex, crystalline polymer, unlike any known organic structure. It was not alive, but it possessed a startling property. It was autocatalytic. It could self-replicate. In the lab, under controlled conditions, the team introduced this polymer to a sterile mixture of basic organic chemicals. What happened next was the breakthrough they had been chasing. The polymer began to organize the amino acids and nucleobases around it, using them as building blocks. It assembled them into a short, stable chain that was structurally identical to the Lazarus sequence. They hadn't found a piece of alien technology. They had found its blueprint, its seed. Dr. Reed named it the Genesis particle. It was a naturally occurring extraterrestrial agent that could hijack native biology and insert its own information. It wasn't a weapon fired from another world. It was a random cosmic delivery, a molecular message in a bottle that had arrived on the primordial Earth billions of years ago. For eons, it had integrated itself into the fabric of life, a dormant potential waiting for a trigger. The particle was not the cataclysm, but merely the loaded chamber. The final piece of the puzzle remained. What on earth had finally pulled the trigger? The origin of the Genesis particle was cosmic, but its activation was entirely terrestrial. The final answer to the silent extinction was not found in the stars or in the genetic code alone, but in the interplay between the two, written into the geological history of our own planet. The investigation turned its focus to the era immediately preceding the mass extinction, a period characterized by an unprecedented explosion of life. For a time, the world was more vibrant and populous than ever before. This biological boom, scientists now realized, was not the prelude to the disaster. It was the first symptom of it. The Lazarus sequence, seeded by the Genesis particle, had been a dormant passenger in the DNA of countless organisms for billions of years. It needed a specific environmental key to unlock its potential. The culprits who turned that key were not intelligent beings or malicious invaders, but a humble and globally dominant life form. The prime suspect, a novel strain of photosynthetic cyanobacteria. Flourishing in the ancient oceans, these microorganisms began to alter the entire planet's chemistry on a scale never seen before. Their metabolic process released a unique combination of trace elements and gases into the atmosphere and oceans, slowly changing the world. This new global environment was the trigger. It switched on the Lazarus sequence. Suddenly, 75% of the species on Earth, those carrying the sequence, became hyper-efficient. They outcompeted their neighbors for resources, leading to a massive but temporary surge in their populations. They had mastered their environment. But this mastery was a trap. The very sequence that gave them their advantage also imposed a crippling rigidity. It streamlined their biology so perfectly that it suppressed the random genetic mutations that allow a species to adapt. They became a world of specialists, perfectly tuned to one specific set of conditions. When the next planetary cycle began, a minor ice age or a shift in ocean currents, these hyper-specialized species were unable to change. They were brittle. They possessed no genetic flexibility to cope with a slightly colder or different world. There was no struggle, no great war for survival. They simply faded away, their perfect biological engines stalling in unison. The architects of this extinction were the cyanobacteria, which had unintentionally created a world that activated a latent cosmic vulnerability. They were architects by accident. The story of the silent extinction is a profound and sobering lesson that life's greatest strengths can hide its most fatal weaknesses, and that the seeds of our end can be planted by our own success. The year is 2025. The Great Correction, as the historians call it, is over. But the defining feature of this new era is not what is present, but what is absent. The world is not loud anymore. The dawn chorus, once a global symphony of billions of voices, is now a sparse, melancholic solo. This is the planet in the wake of the silent extinction. Humanity survived, but it inherited a ghost world. Ecologically, the consequences were catastrophic and immediate. Food webs, intricate systems woven over millions of years, did not just fray, they disintegrated. The disappearance of key pollinators led to the collapse of entire plant families, turning once lush landscapes into monotonous green carpets of only the hardiest, wind-pollinated species. Without apex predators to control populations, a few opportunistic generalists, creatures adaptable enough to survive the chaos, exploded in number. Vast territories are now dominated by a handful of species, creating a fragile and unstable biosphere. This new, simplified ecosystem is dangerously susceptible to disease and climatic shifts. Scientists of the 23rd century call it the Age of Weeds, a reference to both the dominant flora and the scavenger-like fauna that prospered. The oceans, once teeming with kaleidoscopic diversity, became vast, quiet deserts of microbial mats and jellyfish blooms. The great coral reefs, the vibrant cities of the sea, are now bone-white necropolises, their architects long gone. For the humans who lived through the transition, the psychological toll was immense. A new condition, sensory deprivation grief, was identified, describing the profound unease caused by the lack of natural sounds, smells, and sights that had been the backdrop of human existence for millennia. Children born into this new world learn about tigers, elephants, and blue whales the way we learned about dinosaurs, as magnificent monsters from a lost time, known only through digital reconstructions and faded data files. The planet was not destroyed in fire and fury, but hollowed out, leaving a beautiful, functional, yet profoundly empty shell. Humanity had won its war against nature, and its prize was total, undisputed dominion over a silent kingdom of ghosts. In the century following the Great Silence, humanity turned inward. The loss was not just biological, it was cultural, spiritual, and psychological. We had become the last complex storytellers on a planet that had lost most of its stories. Art movements emerged that reflected this new reality. Minimalist realism depicted the stark, simplified landscapes with haunting accuracy. Music became more electronic and abstract, as composers no longer had the rich tapestry of animal sounds to draw inspiration from. A global project, the Echo Archive, was established, dedicated to preserving and recreating the soundscapes of the lost world. In soundproofed chambers, paleo-acousticians used advanced algorithms and the few remaining audio fragments to simulate the roar of a lion or the song of a humpback whale. These became the most popular exhibits in museums, where visitors would sit in contemplative silence, listening to the ghosts of a vibrant past. The concept of wilderness transformed. National parks, once protected for their biodiversity, were now preserved as silent sanctuaries, memorials to what was lost. People would hike for days through beautiful but eerily quiet forests, the only sounds being the wind and their own footsteps. This profound isolation from the natural world had a measurable impact on the human psyche. The phenomenon of solastalgia, the distress caused by witnessing the degradation of one's home environment, became a chronic, species-wide condition. It was a collective melancholy, a sense of being fundamentally alone in the universe, stranded on the only home we had ever known. Religion and philosophy grappled with the new questions. What was humanity's purpose in a world it had so thoroughly dominated and diminished? Were we stewards who had failed, or simply a biological force that had run its course? The irony was crushing. For centuries, we had searched the stars for signs of intelligent life, hoping to answer the question, are we alone? We finally found the answer, not in the distant cosmos, but in the deafening silence of our own backyard. We were, for all intents and purposes, utterly and completely alone, surrounded by the echoes of the family we never knew we had until it was gone. Out of the collective grief and guilt, a new global purpose began to form. Humanity, the agent of the Great Silence, would now become the architect of the Great Restoration. This monumental undertaking became known as the Ark Projects. It was the single largest scientific and engineering initiative in human history, dwarfing the space programs of previous centuries. The mission was deceptively simple: to protect, preserve, and propagate every single remaining species on Earth, the surviving 25%. The most visible elements were the bio-citadels. These were colossal, self-contained ecosystems built in the most stable regions of the planet, from the arid plains of Australia to the frozen expanses of Siberia. Each citadel was a hermetically sealed bubble, miles across, recreating a specific biome with painstaking detail. Inside, teams of biologists, geneticists, and ecologists worked tirelessly, becoming the guardians of these precious fragments of the old world. Parallel to this was the Life Vault initiative. Deep beneath the permafrost of a remote Arctic island, a facility was constructed to house the genetic legacy of the planet. It was an expansion of the old Svalbard Global Seed Vault, but its scope was infinitely more ambitious. It held cryogenically frozen embryos, eggs, and tissue samples of tens of thousands of animal species, a genetic library of Alexandria for the biosphere. Leading the charge was the Global Biodiversity Alliance, or GBA, an international body with unprecedented authority. Its first director, Dr. Ilara Vance, became the face of the movement. In her inaugural address, broadcast to the entire planet, she stated, "We are not just saving species, we are saving our own humanity. We broke this world with our carelessness. We will now begin to mend it with our care." The challenges were immense. Breeding programs were slow and fraught with difficulty. Genetic bottlenecks threatened the long-term viability of many species. Recreating the complex interplay of a functioning ecosystem proved to be far more difficult than anyone had imagined. Yet, there were moments of profound triumph. The birth of the first Sumatran rhino in a century and a half broadcast live from the Borneo bio-citadel, brought the world to a standstill. It was a tiny flicker of light, a fragile symbol that perhaps the silence did not have to be permanent. The ARC projects were not a solution, but a promise from a chastened species to the silent planet that it would spend the rest of its existence trying to atone for its mistakes. With the remaining species secured within the ARC projects, humanity stood at a new precipice, facing its most audacious and ethically complex challenge yet: de-extinction. The Life Vault was not just a museum, it was a repository of blueprints. Using advanced genomic sequencing and CRISPR-based gene editing tools, scientists believed they could do more than just preserve life. They could, in theory, bring it back. The field of resurrection biology became the most funded and most controversial area of science. The debate raged in the global forums. Proponents, led by geneticist Dr. Jian Li, argued it was a moral imperative. "We are not playing God," she famously argued. "We are cleaning up a mess we made. We have the tools to restore the voices to the silent choir. To not use them is the ultimate act of hubris." Opponents, like bioethicist Dr. Aris Thorne, warned of unforeseen consequences. "The world these creatures knew is gone," he cautioned. "An animal resurrected into a foreign ecosystem is not a restoration, it is a creation. We would be creating biological orphans, artifacts with no natural context, and we have no idea how they would interact with our simplified, fragile biosphere." Despite the controversy, the GBA authorized a pilot program. The target was not a dinosaur or a mammoth, but a small, unassuming insect, the Seraphina moth, a species that had been the exclusive pollinator for the critically endangered lunar orchid. The moth's DNA was painstakingly reassembled from preserved specimens, its genome inserted into the egg of a closely related living species. After years of failures, the breakthrough came. In a sterile lab in the Andes bio-citadel, a chrysalis wiggled. A creature that had not existed for 2 centuries emerged, its wings shimmering with a familiar, pearlescent glow. The moment it took flight was broadcast globally. It was a scientific marvel, a testament to human ingenuity. The moth was released into a sealed greenhouse containing the last lunar orchids. The world watched, holding its collective breath. The tiny creature, guided by instincts encoded in its resurrected genes, flew directly to a flower. This single act, this reunion of plant and pollinator across an abyss of time, was more than a success. It was a paradigm shift. Humanity was no longer just a keeper of a diminished world. It was now a potential author of its next chapter. The successful revival of the Seraphina moth opened the floodgates, but it did not solve the fundamental problems. The 25th century is an age of contradictions. It is an era of unprecedented ecological management and technological prowess, yet it is also an era of permanent loss. De-extinction is a slow, painstaking process. For every success story, there are 1,000 species whose genetic material is too degraded, whose ecological niche is too thoroughly erased. The great mammals, the charismatic megafauna that once captured the human imagination, remain ghosts in the machine, their genomes too complex, their environmental needs too vast for the current world to support. Humanity has learned a humbling lesson. It is infinitely easier to destroy than to create. The bio-citadels are marvels, but they are also reminders of our failure. Beautiful, curated gardens in place of a wild, self-sustaining planet. We are now permanent gardeners, and the world is our ward. The responsibility is absolute. Every weather pattern, every soil nutrient level, every population dynamic is monitored and managed. The planet has, in effect, been placed in intensive care, with humanity as its eternal physician. The legacy of silence is therefore twofold. It is the permanent, unrecoverable absence of the 75%. Their songs will never be heard again. Their forms will never grace the earth. Their unique evolutionary stories have been terminated. This silence is a scar on the planet's soul, a constant reminder of the cost of ignorance and arrogance. But the second legacy is the lesson that silence taught us. It forced humanity to finally see itself not as separate from nature, but as its most powerful, and therefore most responsible, component. From the ashes of our greatest failure, we found a new, unifying purpose: the stewardship of life itself. The future remains unwritten. Will we use our newfound power wisely? Can we maintain the vigilance required to manage a global ecosystem? Or will our hubris resurface? Looking at the Earth from orbit, it still appears as a vibrant blue marble. But we know the truth. We live on a convalescing world, a world of beautiful ghosts and fragile survivors. Our most important task is to listen to the life that remains, and to listen to the silence, ensuring we never forget the price that was paid for its lesson.